Here in northwest Donegal, on an elevated site, lies the ruins of a 16th century abbey, 2 old stone crosses and the outer walls still visible of an ancient monastery. This is modern day Garton Abbey, once called Rathcrow, the Fort of the Nuts, and it was on this very site 1500 years ago a man was born into the royal household of the Northern Enale dynasty, a man who would become one of the most significant Celtic Christian leaders, who would establish a series of abbeys and monasteries in Ireland and the British Isles, who would be looked upon for spiritual guidance from the Irish, British and continental European monks and missionaries, and who would be a key catalyst in promoting a thriving literary and learning revival, changing the course of history forever. And that man was St. Colmcille, a name that means Dove of the Church, also named St. Columba in Latin, and for which he is better known in the British Isles. To mark this special 1500th anniversary year of his birth, the Colmcille 1500th Anniversary Committee, in response to the restrictions of no indoor social gatherings imposed by the COVID pandemic, presents a 3-part virtual series that has invited a broad range of contributors who will tell the story of Colmcille and follow him through his life and legacy to reveal how the man as monk, exile, missionary and diplomat all combined to reshape the Gaelic Christian landscape and its inhabitants, not only in Ireland, Scotland and Northern England, but beyond to include mainland Europe. In this first part of the series, Most Reverend Alan McGuckian, Bishop of Raphoe, will offer a perspective on Colmcille's early life influences that shaped his decision to forfeit a life of aristocratic privilege and political power to lead a life as a monk.
Before we look at Colmcille in Donegal or Derry or Iona, I want first of all to think of him as a monk. He was part of a radical movement that had begun just about 200 years before he was born. There hadn't always been monks. So what was that all about? It began in Egypt. It was a lay movement. It had nothing to do with the clergy at the beginning, and it was very extreme. It began with a man called Anthony, an Egyptian who was well off. And one day in church, he heard the reading from Matthew's Gospel. If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. He felt called to take it literally. He had inherited his family's wealth. He gave some of the land to neighbours, sold the rest, gave the money to the poor, and headed to the desert. And there he lived as a hermit, embracing a very radical asceticism. For years on end, he lived in total isolation, praying and fasting. People heard about him, they were fascinated, and they came out in numbers to find out what was going on. He had the reputation of being very close to God. At first, he ignored them, and he stuck to his hermit ways. But in time, he came to realize that he had to share with them something of what was going on. So this movement, away out into the desert, began to become a point of instruction. There was another very important thing going on at that time. That was the Emperor Constantine in 313 signed the Edict of Milan, whereby the church became the religion of the empire. Before that, Christians had been illegal. They were persecuted. But from then on, they were part of the status quo. Priests and bishops became like the mayors of local towns, the heads of the judiciary. They were very much part of the status quo, and many people felt that the church was becoming very worldly. The monks, on the other hand, were going in the exact opposite direction. They went out into the desert. They wanted to get away from this worldliness. And they set themselves a 3-step process on the way to holiness. The steps were purgatio, or in Greek, catharsis. Second, illuminatio, illumination. In Greek they call it theoria. And the third was unitio, unity, or theosis in Greek. Purgatio, or catharsis, you can have a sense that was the monk felt that he had to confront his weak and fleshly side, confront his tendency towards gluttony, towards lust, and towards the desire for possessions. Consequently, they lived a really hard life. Illuminatio, when they got to that stage, they began to open up to the light. They listened very carefully to the Gospels, and particularly to Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount, and at that time they had to begin at least to welcome guests and to show charity, especially to the poor. And the third step, this unitio, the Greek is really telling. Theosis means divinization. That means that you become so close to God that you become like God. You become a part of God. So those were the phases that the monks were living through, and living through with great seriousness. How did what was going on in Egypt get to Ireland? One way was the direct way. There's no doubt that Irish sailors were going to Egypt and Egyptian sailors were going to Ireland. There's a very good case made that our Sean Nos singing in Gaelic sounds Arabic. It sounds like the way the monks would have sung their prayers in Arabic in the Egyptian desert. But it also passed over time and through space across Europe. And there are two figures I want to mention in particular. The first poem that was written about Colmcille was written the year after he died by the great poet Dallan Forgill. And Dallan mentions two characters, two great saints who had a huge influence on Colmcille in that very early poem. And they were St. Basil the Great and St. John Cassian. Basil. St. Basil lived in the 4th century. He was a lawyer, a nominal Christian, but he had no conviction. And then something happened. He says, "I had wasted much time on follies and spent nearly all my youth in vain labours and devotion to wisdom that was foolish before God. Suddenly, I awoke as out of a deep sleep. I beheld the wonderful light of the gospel truth, and I recognized the nothingness of the wisdom of the princes of this world." So Basil made his way from Caesarea, where he lived, down to Egypt. He lived a very radical life, but gradually came to see that there were two things going on down there. One was there was a powerful movement of the Spirit leading people to God, and the other was that there was an extremism and an elitism and a heresy even that saw the way of the monks as being the only way for people to come close to God and to be pleasing to God. Though Basil's heart was in the desert, he knew that he was called back to serve the world and serve the church in the cities and in the towns. There was another very important thing that we have to mention. At that time, the church was riven with the heresy of Arianism. The people who did not believe that Jesus was truly God. You know the truth that we profess every Sunday at Mass and the Creed? The Arians almost won out. And Basil felt the need to go first of all to the Council of Constantinople, where he took the side of the true faith. Then he went back home to Syria, and he was called on by the people to be first of all a priest and then their bishop. He set up monasteries. He had a great care for the poor. So you can see how the monasticism that had started as a radical flight from the world was beginning to come back into the world, though still very much not of the world. Dallan Forgill, when he tells us about Basil, wants to tell us that Colmcille really was a man of the world at that time. In his poem he writes, "Rome was known to him, order was known to him, knowledge of the Godhead was granted to him, truly blessed when he died. He was wise about apostles, about angels. He applied the judgments of Basil, who forbids acts of boasting by great hosts." Basil the Great was a very sophisticated theologian and spiritual guide, and he was a huge influence on Colmcille. The second figure that Dallin mentions, John Cassian. He wanted us to know that, he repeats this because he wants us to know that Colum was a scholar and a teacher. So what did Dallin say that included Cassian? He's talking about Colmcille here. "The teacher, Colum, wove the word. By his wisdom he made glosses clear. He fixed the Psalms. He made known the books of the law, those books that Cassian loved." So who was John Cassian, and how was he part of the movement that brought monasticism all the way from Egypt to Donegal? He was born around 360 in the area that would today be Romania. Like many others, he was attracted by what he heard about this new movement, so he headed south to Egypt. He stopped in Bethlehem on his way, so monasticism had already moved out of the desert and had got as far as Bethlehem. Cassian became a very serious ascetic, but he realized, just like Basil, that he couldn't stay in the desert. He needed to serve the wider church, which was struggling still with Arianism. He went to Constantinople, and then he went to Rome, and ultimately, John Cassian founded 2 monasteries in France, in Marseille. This was the beginning, the arrival of monasticism in Western Europe, inching its way slowly towards Ireland. There was a certain ferment and chaos in the monasticism that was rife, as we have said at that time. Cassian was a very wholesome and level-headed and sensible man. So he wrote about monastic life, calling people away from extremism towards a monasticism that was in community, lived charity, and love for the poor. He wrote about the spiritual life in a way that encouraged others to foster a radical spiritual life in a way that was wholesome and healthy. And he was one of the big influences on Colmcille. When the Christian faith came to Ireland in the 5th century, monasticism was a major part of it. We're almost certain that Patrick went to Tours, where the great St. Martin of Tours was an influence on him, and so the faith that came to Ireland was monastic from the very beginning, and monasteries began to spring up for men and women all over Ireland. The monastic ideal of leaving everything in order to choose God alone seems to have appealed to something in the Irish character. At the same time, when Colmcille, the son of Donegal aristocrats, who could have been a high king had he chosen, when he chose to live a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, it must have seemed absurd to many in his family and his tribe. But we can see that he was caught up in a charismatic movement that was very deep, that had become extremely sophisticated, and had already taken many countries by storm.
Our second contributor is well-known Christy Gillespie, local historian and published author of St. Columcille, A Life's Journey, who will concentrate on the rich history of the saint's local area of Garton and surround, while also focusing on the central role his mother played in her son's decision to choose a life as a pilgrim for Christ.
Hello, my name is Christy Gillespie, and I have been invited by the committee of the Colmcille 1500 to give you a short talk on the saint, and I would like to thank them for doing so. I wish to dedicate the presentation to the late Margaret Alcorn, a proud native of Garton who had great devotion to Columcille and who did much to promote her local saint. Given that it is the 1500th commemoration of the birth of the great saint, I thought it entirely appropriate that we should maybe concentrate this talk on his place of birth and on the general area surrounding Garton. Before I start, just a wee bit of background about how I got involved in the whole story of Columcille. I would have to admit that my relationship with Columcille was not always a harmonious one. I was born and raised in Kilcar in the southwest of the county. I played football for that parish for many years, where our great rivals and sworn enemies were the men from the Glen, St Columba's and neighbouring Glen Columcille. It was in truth a very healthy rivalry, but naturally anything to do with Glen was off limits, and so St Columcille was kind of off the agenda, if that makes sense. That was all to change in 1993 when I was appointed principal of Scoil Columcille in Charman, a small Gaeltacht school which at that time had 100 pupils and a staff of 4 teachers. Termon National School is one of the 1,300 schools in Ireland and Great Britain that are named in honour of the saint. But this school could certainly lay claim to being the local school of Columcille, as it takes in the children of the Garton area, or around the lakes as it is known locally. Both the school and the area around it is known as Termon, because it was located within the Charman, or sanctuary land, that belonged to one of Columcille's many monasteries at neighbouring Kilmacrenna. This school is equidistant from where he was born in Garton, baptised in Temple Douglas, and where he first began his education in Kilmacrenna. He would eventually, as we will learn, come back to establish 3 of his many monasteries in this area. Just 4 years later, in 1997, it happened to be the 1400th commemoration of the saint's death on the 9th of June 597. By the way, a saint's feast day always occurs on the date of their death rather than the more usual date of birth. This was because the day of death was considered as the day that they threw off their mortal coil and ascended into heaven, and so a glorious or feast day. We decided as a school that we should do something to suitably mark that occasion, and in the end we decided on compiling a book about the saint. We planned that it would give an outline of his life in the first half, and that the second part would contain a detailed guided trail of the saint's local area, taking you from site to historical site, explaining what could be seen on the ground when you got there. We published for a number of reasons. Firstly, to give the children more of an awareness of their rich heritage through being involved in the research. To try and raise some badly needed funds for school building projects at a time when money from the department was certainly in short supply. And crucially, to put the importance of the saint's local area back into his life story. Up until the publication of that book, the saint's local area had in truth received scant coverage really. Most books about Columcille would mention all right that he was born in Garton, before whisking him away on his educational tour, then leading on to setting up of monasteries, before leaving Ireland for Iona to spread the good news throughout Alba or Scotland. You all know this well-thumbed pattern. But where you are born and raised, I am sure you would agree, has much more of an importance in your formation. Quite apart from your genetics and the family or clan grouping into which you are born, surely your area molds you for better or for worse into the type of person that you become. This book did very well for us and sold out 2 editions, and many's the time since I've been asked for copies. So on the lead up to this, the next big anniversary, I've been hard at work researching to go again and bring out a much bigger and updated version which will be titled In Columcille's Footsteps. We followed up that Columcille book with a map of the area, showing the main Columban sites which detailed information about them on the back. Then we finished with the building of a Columban monument beside the school, a 3D version of such of the book. It was designed to resemble the abbey remains at Kilmacrennan, and it features a replica of the window of the Temple Douglas Church and the Garton oratory door. A stone from each of the Columban sites in the area were set into the walls. Among the 36 stones is a stone from Iona, a lintel stone from the original monastery in Kilmacrennan, and a mitred head sculpture that once sat above the main door of the abbey in Kilmacrennan. And now, as we approach the 1500th commemoration of his birth, I think it appropriate that we should maybe focus some attention again on his birthplace and local area, and also on his mother Ethna. We will look at the important role that she undoubtedly played in not alone promoting Christianity in that area, but also in steering her son into a life of monasticism. Colmcille lived some 1500 years ago, or a millennium and a half ago. To put that into some kind of perspective, a generation lasts for a span of 30 years on average. So to get back to the time of your great-grandfather or your great-grandmother, for example, would take 90 years. To get back to Colmcille's time, you are looking at 50 greats. Plenty of time for history to be lost and forgotten, which has been the case, and also indeed for stories to be made up or added to. For Irish people love a good story, and to be associated with individuals of prestige, famous people if you like. And given that in that millennium and a half that much fable and legend has built up around the saint, not to mention self-fulfilling prophecies and poetry that he was supposed to have composed, then it can sometimes be a very hard task to separate fact from fiction. But thankfully, we have some useful written sources to pull from. These include the 3 lives of Colmcille. The first life of the saint was written on Iona by Colmcille's successor, Aunan in Irish, or Adamnan in Latin, whose name we have simplified as Eunan. He was the 9th abbot and a very accomplished man in his own right. He lived 100 years after the saint died and had the chance to interview monks who had met or had known the saint. However, his book is not a straightforward account of the saint's life, but is instead a hagiography, or a biography that presents its subject in a very holy light. This life is divided up into 3 sections, giving account of Colmcille's prophecies, his miracles, and his angelic visions. Yet by studying this collection of short stories carefully, you can pick up a lot of vital information about the monastic way of life and other important background information. This image here is of Dorben's copy of Adamnan's life, the oldest to have survived, which was completed some 30 years after the original. It is named after the scribe who copied it and who would himself go on to succeed Adamnan as abbot of Iona. This lovely manuscript is now held in Schaffhausen in Switzerland. Next of the lives is the middle life, written in Derry around 1150, which for the first time lays out Colmcille's life story in some sort of a chronological order. We know that the location for it was Derry because it was at that time the head and centre of the Columban Federation of Monasteries, and it is pushed very strongly as being Colmcille's first monastery and the best loved by the saint. Lastly, we have the very large Donegal life, or Baha Colmcille, finished in 1532 by Manus O'Donnell. Manus was grandfather of Red Hugh O'Donnell, and who 5 years after compiling this major work was to take over as chieftain of the O'Donnells. These O'Donnells believed fervently that they were the direct descendants of the saint's clan. This manuscript was completed just 11 years after the 1000th anniversary of the saint's birth. It undoubtedly gave the future chieftain the inspiration to get a team of Franciscan monks together, which he sent out all over Donegal and the rest of the country, researching all of the stories and tales, both oral and written, pertaining to the saint. It was all brought together and written up in his castle in Lifford. It is a huge book and contains a lot of useful information on the beliefs and practices that have built up concerning the saint in the 1,000 years since the birth of Colmcille. The Bodleian Library in Oxford has the original manuscript with this depiction of Colmcille in his regalia on the back. Of course, a lot of information can also be garnered from the various annals, from the earliest, the Annals of Ulster, through to the much later Annals of the Four Masters. What all of these annals have in common is that they use as their early foundation source a collection known as the Annals or Chronicles of Iona, compiled by the monks there, where they began to properly document the history of Ireland and Britain for the first time, year by year. This Chronicle of Iona does not survive in its own right, but you can see evidence of it right throughout the earlier sections of later annals that depended on it for their early source material. Honourable mention should also be given to the Venerable Bede, the English historian monk who wrote the first detailed account of the history of Britain in 1732, about 130 years after Colmcille had died. He gives a good account of Colmcille coming to Scotland and also details information on how St. Aidan, one of the Iona monks, founded Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumbria and then strove to bring Christianity to the people of northern England. He gives a very concise account of how Columban monks lived and operated, making their own lives an example to those that they were trying to convert. There is, of course, loads of other sources of information, chief among them this folio held in the collection of Durham Cathedral. This was written at the same time as the copy of Adamnan's life, and which lists the names of Colmcille's brothers and sisters, as well as naming the 12 that accompanied him as he left for exile in Iona. These are the only such lists in existence, and without them, we would be much the poorer when it comes to hard information on the saint's life. Those are, of course, all written sources of information. Indeed, historians would point out, and rightly so, that there is no documentary evidence at all that Colmcille was born in Garton until it was noted in what became known as the Middle Life of the Saint, written in Derry around 1150. But as we have seen, it was actually the monks on Iona that were the first to start writing down history in a systematic manner. And so this period around when Colmcille was alive and all that came before that is prehistory as such. And so we have to look for other sources instead in helping us to build a narrative. You have often heard the saying that something has been written in stone. There is actually a lovely saying around the Carlingford area in County Louth which goes, if you kick a stone, then it will tell you a story. And that is so true, as so often you will find the history of an area written into place names and into sites. And like the spokes of a great cartwheel, as you get closer and closer to Garton, not only do the sites associated with Colmcille get much more numerous, but so also do the place names, which demonstrates a clear connection with the saint and his clan. Because in Irish, all place names describe their setting perfectly, either geographically or sometimes something to do with the location's history instead. To give you a very good example of this, the area across Lough Kibben from Garton is known as Chirargus, which is the largest townland in the parish of Termon in Garton. Chirargus means the land of Fergus, Fergus being the paternal grandfather of Colmcille. This townland has undoubtedly been known by this name since before Colmcille's time, demonstrating that this area was under the control of Colmcille's grandfather, being as he was chieftain of the local clan who ruled both here and the much wider area surrounding it. We'll kick off our story of the background to Colmcille's birth with a character that we all know well from our time in national school, being Niall of the Nine Hostages. He was a king of Connacht and who became nominal High King of Ireland from roughly 379 to 405. He got his name from extracting sons from his various under-kings to ensure their good behaviour and allegiance. It was while he was on a raid to Dumbarton that he brought Patrick back to Ireland as a slave. Patrick would eventually escape, but would come back and do so much to kickstart the Christianizing of this country. Niall had at least 8 sons from his 2 marriages, which gave rise to the Niall or Sons of Niall dynasty. The first 4 took the area of Coogameja, including Tara, and became known as the Southern Niall or Sons of Niall. Meanwhile, the other 4 moved north and took over the northwest part of Ireland. 2 of these were Owen, who took Inishowen as his territory and had as his chief residence Greenanalia, and Connell, who controlled most of what we would call Donegal today, along with an additional area as far as the River Foyle, now covered by part of Derry City. He gave his name to the county, Tirconnell, and his kinsfolk were known as the Kinnell Connell or Clan of Connell. The Book of Fina tells us that this territory of Connells, or effectively Donegal minus Inishowen, was in turn subdivided into three between his sons, and it appears that Colmcille's grandfather Fergus was granted control of an area between the rivers Swilly, flowing through Letterkenny, as far as the Crowley or the Dore River. This Dore River, which separates the parishes of Gweedore and the Rosses, takes its water from Loughnure Lake before making its short journey out to the sea. Fergus, if you remember, is the man who gave his name to the townland of Chearargus, opposite to Garton, where Colmcille was to be born. This kingdom would eventually be passed in turn to Fergus's son Philemy, father of Colmcille, who married Ethna. She most likely came from royal Leinster stock, but from where exactly we are not sure. So Colmcille was not just born into any ordinary family, but had plenty of power and prestige on both sides, which was to open many doors for him later as he tried to build up his own ecclesiastical kingdom. It appears that Colmcille's mother Ethna did much to help Christianity in the area, as the original name for the monastery in Kilmacrennan was Dira Ethna, or the Oak Grove of Ethna. Now, this name tells us a number of things. The oak was a sacred tree for the pre-Christians, and they performed their sacred rites in clearings or groves in these oak woods. Early Christian evangelizers actively sought out these groves into which they would site their first churches and small monasteries. So it is safe to assume that this place was not long a Christian site, and that the name clearly supports the view that Ethna was sponsoring the new Christian settlement built there. There is also a nearby holy well on the very boundary of the land belonging to this monastery in Kilmacrennan. It is in the townland of Barnes and Terman and is known as Tuber Ethna. Now, it is very unusual to have a Christian well named after somebody who wasn't an Irish saint, and so she must have been held in very high respect and esteem by those in the locality. It was in one of the father's many forts, this one guarding the area of Garton, that Colmcille was born on the 9th of December 521. One can still see the ramparts of this ancient hill fort surrounding the graveyard there. It was called Rathcano, the hill fort of the nuts, named after the many horse chestnut trees that still grow in front of this venerable site. We are told by Manus O'Donnell that on the night before Colmcille's birth, that his mother had a vision where an angel instructed her to go down to Lough Kibben below the hill fort, and there she would find a flagstone, the birthstone, and that it was to be brought back up to the hill fort. She brought some of her kinsfolk with her, and on their way back carrying this stone, they journeyed through the small Altahuri Glen, which was the shortest route back. This is a small, secluded glen through which a swift stream flows on its way down to the lake below. We are told that the group stopped for a while to rest where the sickness of childbirth came on Ethna. With the birth of the baby now imminent, they resumed their journey back to the hill fort. One of the kinsmen who was helping with the carrying of the flagstone began covering up the blood-stained area with bracken and leaves. Aware of the holy significance that this man was placing on the spot, Ethna assured him that his efforts were unnecessary, as nobody except himself and his descendants would ever be able to relocate it. This location was to give rise to where the famous Garton clay is lifted to this very day. It is a medium porcelain clay which is lifted by male members of the local frail family only. They begin to lift this clay after reaching a certain age of maturity. They recite specific prayers, and when the clay is then lifted, it is brought back home to be dried out. If the clay is needed for some reason, then you approach a member of these frails who will give you a small packet of it. When researching for the Colmcille book back in 1997, I asked Dan Friel, who was a parent of the school, why it was him and his family that had the honour of doing this. He could shed no further light, save to explain that his father and grandfather before him had done it, and so that it was very much a family tradition passed on faithfully from generation to generation. But on doing further research, I was to discover that these particular Friels are actually direct descendants from Colmcille's only brother Owen, and so this practice may very well have been going on now unbroken for the past 1500 years. The clay itself has plenty medicinal and preventative properties, and locals would also never consider going on a journey without it. It has naturally, over the years, caused some consternation with customs officials at airports, given as it often presents as a small bag of white powder. Colmcille was born on the birthstone on December 521. For many centuries, thousands of pilgrims would come to this flagstone right up until the end of the 16th century. But eventually, this flagstone was to disappear, possibly as early as plantation times. As a result, the actual birth site was to be confused with another location, which had and still has its very large flagstone in situ, and which also had a Columban legend attached to it. This is the nearby Llachnacui, less than a mile further to the west. Llachnacui means the flagstone of loneliness, and Manus O'Donnell, in his Life of the Saint, tells us the background to how this flagstone got its name. Once he, Colmcille, was in a certain place called Garton or Field of the Flagstone in Garton, westward of Rathknow, the place where he was born. A local man came to him because many of his friends and kinsmen had died, and he was heavy and sorrowful after them. The extent of his sorrow was so great that he would rather die than live after them. And when Colmcille saw him, he had great pity for him, and he blessed a flagstone that was beside him, and gave that man water from it to drink, so that his sorrow disappeared. And Colmcille left as a grace on that stone, that the sorrow of anyone who would drink from it would leave them. And from that time, this has been verified. And the flagstone of the sorrows, Llachnacui, is the name of that flagstone today in memory of that great miracle. So as you can see, Manus O'Donnell in the 1530s was well aware of this flagstone's existence, but he is at pains to point out that it is to the west of where he was born, which was Rathknow, or where the graveyard is now. But sadly, if you go out to visit at present, there are brown historical signs placed on the roadside which point to Llachnacui as being the birthplace of the saint. This has added to great confusion, and they really should be taken down. What probably didn't help was when Mrs. Cornelia Adair sighted a large Celtic cross beside Llachnacui. It is on the border of her estate and very close to where the last of the 47 families, the Bradleys, had been thrown out of their cottages during the Derryveigh evictions of 1861, initiated by her husband, the infamous John George Adair. After his death in America, she tried to make restitution of sorts, including the erection of this cross. In light of her husband's despicable actions, it is rather ironic that she had Colmcille's last instructions to his monks incised on this cross: preserve with each other sincere charity and peace. In fairness to her, she does not mention anywhere on this cross that this location is the saint's birthplace. On the evening before some of these evictees left to emigrate to Australia, they came to this flagstone of loneliness, hoping that the terrible sadness of leaving their local area forever would not hit them too hard. According to local tradition, Colmcille himself also visited on the eve of leaving Tirconnell for the final time as he set out on voluntary exile to become a pilgrim of Christ, as Adaman puts it. Following his birth, the infant child was immediately brought to the nearby church of Temple Douglas and baptized by a monk named Cracknahan. This clearly demonstrates that Christianity had already gained an early foothold in the area. Although this holy water font in the church in Kilmacrennan is reputed to be the one used to baptize the child, this one probably came from the later church in Temple Douglas, or alternately the nearby abbey in Kilmacrennan. Manus O'Donnell informs us that the original font was disposed of. He tells us that for many years the sick would be brought from far and wide to this flagstone on which he was baptized to seek help. But it was to become a heavy burden on the lady tasked with being a scourgeon or hereditary keeper. So the accursed woman put the blessed stone in a flax dam of water north of the settlement there in Kilmacrennan, and it hasn't been found since then. But there is a prophecy that it will be found and the place will prosper from then on. The infant was given the Celtic name of Criffan, or the fox, which was not unusual at all when you read throughout the various annalistic entries of that period. While he was still very young, his mother was to send her son to Kilmacrennan under the fosterage of Cruithnahan, his baptizer, to begin his first steps in this new life of monasticism. Now, the young lad could very easily have followed in the path of his father and grandfather and become head of his powerful clan, but instead a completely different career was being mapped out for him. It appears as a result that the overall control of his clan then passed to the branch of his uncle Setna instead, one of whose sons and a first cousin of Colmcille's would eventually go on to become overall leader of the Kinnell Connell, and first from that clan to be titled High King of the Exile. Another son, Luiach, got control of this heartland area, and so this portion between the Swilly and the Crawley rivers became known as Tír Luiach and the clan the Kinnell Luiach. It would be from this base that the O'Donnell family would eventually emerge and take over control of the county. The young Columcille, or Criffan, was sent to Cruithnahan's small monastery, which was situated close to where Kilmacrennan town now stands, out the modern-day Milford Road. This foundation, which consisted of a church and at least one house, was built on a rocky spur of high ground between the Lennon and Lurgy rivers. It was known as Dira Ethna at that time. Cruithnahan was soon to realise that his young foster child was blessed by God. Adamnan tells us this tale that one night, as Cruithnahan returned from saying his offices in the nearby church, he saw the whole house bathed in a bright light, and poised over the face of the sleeping child was a fiery ball of light. He began to tremble and bowed his face to the ground, for he recognized that the grace of the Holy Spirit was poured from heaven upon his foster son, and he stood in awe. It was probably because of this incident that motivated the change of the young boy's name from Criffan to Colum, the Irish word for a dove. For as Adamnan so beautifully puts it, so great a name cannot have been given to the man of God but by divine providence. For it is shown by the Gospels that the Holy Spirit descended on the only begotten Son of the everlasting Father in the form of that little bird. For the dove is indeed a simple and innocent bird, and it was fitting that a simple and innocent man should have this for his name, who through his dove-like life offered in himself a dwelling for the Holy Spirit. What it says in Proverbs is appropriate here. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. There is clear evidence that during the saint's lifetime and for some time afterwards that he was simply known as Colum, or in Latin Columba. As such, this was his monastic name. The Kill would come only much later as in Columcille, column of the churches, denoting the many churches and monasteries that both the saint and his followers founded. He would eventually leave Cruithnahan and Dira Ethna in order to further his studies chiefly in Leinster. He finally came under the instruction of St. Moby in Glasnevin, Dublin, where in 544 a plague epidemic hit and the abbot was forced to disperse his monastery, sending his charges to their homes. He gave the very strict instructions to Columcille not to found any establishment until he had given him his blessing to do so. He was roughly 24 when he returned home to Tyrconnell. He was immediately offered Diricalagi in Derry by his uncle Setna, a hill fort surrounded by a forest of oak trees on an island in the River Foyle. But mindful of Moby's instruction, he had to refuse. Coming from this Doon or hill fort, he was approached by two messengers, one carrying the girdle of Moby and the second with his permission to begin. His former mentor had succumbed to the plague, which was ravishing Ireland. Moby's death is noted in the Annals of Ulster for that year. Colmcille was to build his first monastery there in Diricalagi, or the Oak Grove of Collega, which began a series of foundations in the northern half of Ireland in the territories of the Exile. They were usually clan hill forts or small churches already established. It is a futile exercise to put a number on them, as it is impossible to say which were established by Colmcille himself and which were founded later by his community. He was to establish 3 of his many monasteries at locations important in his own life story and which were under the control of his family. Firstly, there was Garton. Although it is now 1,500 years old, there are still remnants of the original monastery there on the ground to see if you know what you are looking for. There are the ramparts which first surrounded the hill fort and which was later used to enclose the monastic buildings. Then there are two very weathered crosses which delineate the extent of the monastery proper. The original site of the monastic church, which was right in the middle of the site, being as it was in the centre of the life of the monastery, and it's now in the centre of the graveyard there. The holy well, originally the source of drinking water for the hill fort that preceded the monastery there. Remains of a horizontal cairn stone used to grind corn and barley. And the bell of this monastery that once called the monks to prayer. Up and until the plantation, it was in the possession of a local O'Nahan family, its hereditary keepers, but it eventually ended up being sold and is now in the National Museum of Ireland. Kilvicnanan had been known as Dira Ethna, but once taken over by Colmcille, it was left in the charges of 4 nephews, sons of his sister Michonleth and her husband Nanan, who is also remembered in the townlands of Lithnanan and Machra-Nanan in Letterkenny. And so you get Kilvicnanan, Monastery of the Sons of Nanan. One of the most satisfying achievements of the previous Colmcille book was in managing to pinpoint for the first time the location of the original monastery there. On that day, and standing on site, having finally figured it out, I suddenly noticed a fox looking at me from some rushes not 10 yards away. He looked in my direction for about 10 seconds before slipping away. Make from that story what you will. Then there was Temple Douglas, where he was baptized and where he was reputed to have taken his first steps. There was once a revered station done there on the saint's feast day for people with affliction of the eyes, but the local priest put a stop to it in the 1860s to combat the sale of poaching, which was causing a lot of unruly behaviour on what should have been a very solemn day. Looking at the rest of Donegal or Tirchonell, you had a Columban establishment on Torry, where you can still see the tall cross and the remains of a round tower on that rocky outpost. This is also where the famous Torry clay is lifted, which, different to its cousin Garton clay, helps to keep rodents away instead, as well as protecting fishermen against drowning. Glen Colmcille is the only parish in Ireland that bears his name. It was known as Shan-Glen in ancient times, owing to the extensive number of Stone Age megaliths found there. The saint is supposed to have banished the devils and non-believers out of the glen and then taken it over. There is a fine series of ancient standing stones and other holy sites which make up the Torres there on Colmcille's feast day. It is the longest in Ireland, which begins at sunset and must be completed before sunrise. The monastic settlement is believed to have been situated on the site where the present Church of Ireland now stands. And to back up this theory, while digging a grave there for a man by the surname of Fowles in 1832, the grave diggers chanced on a souterrain running underneath the graveyard, which in monastic times would have served both as a coal storage as well as an escape route if attacked. Drumholm is one of only 3 Irish monasteries mentioned by Adamnan in his book. It's near Ballintra, where the first proper archaeological dig of a Donegal Columban site has been undertaken, giving us a much clearer idea of what life in a monastery was actually like. Also in Donegal you had Raphoe, which, like many of the other Tirchonell monasteries, is to be found on the very periphery or borders of that territory. Outside of Donegal, you had the likes of Durrow, or Darraway, the place of the oak, in County Offaly, which was, during Colmcille's time, his main Columban monastery in Ireland, and mentioned by both Adamnan and the Venerable Bede in their books. Not a lot is now left, apart from a high cross, some grave markers, a holy well, and of course, its association with the famous Book of Durrow, one of the earlier Columban illustrated Gospels. In the Dublin area, you had sword, meaning pure from the Holy Well there, now anglicised as swords, where there is still a very fine round tower. Swords Colmcille is most noteworthy for being the monastery church where the body of Brian Boru was brought for waking after the Battle of Clontarf, before being then brought onto Armagh for burial. Muin Colmcille, or Moon in County Kildare, is known for its very fine slim high cross, the illustrations of which used to feature on RTE television. Then there is Drumcliff on the road from Donegal to Sligo. The road actually cuts through this monastery with the remains of the round tower on one side, while one of the high crosses stands guard in the cemetery on the other side. W.B. Yeats chose to be buried here in a monastery dedicated to the poet saint of Ireland. Yeats's great-grandfather was once the pastor here. 1 mile away is the battle site of Cuilgeravna, where the forces of Columcille's clan met those of the incumbent High King Diarmid in 561 in a major battle that not alone allowed the northern Eniel to take over the High Kingship from their southern cousins, but was undoubtedly also an important factor in Columcille leaving the country just 2 years later. Although the reasons behind this battle were quite complex, a later narrative would attest that it centred around the well-known story of Columcille surreptitiously copying a book of Psalms, and when its owner, St. Finian of Movilla, one of Columcille's former teachers, found out, he demanded his book back along with the ill-gotten copy. But Columcille refused, and the case was referred to King Diarmid. But when he found in favour of Finian, Columcille still refused to hand over his copy, and so the battle lines were drawn. 2 years after this major conflict, Columcille with 12 of his followers was to leave from Derry for permanent exile. He founded a new monastery on the small island of Iona off the Scottish coast, from where he moved to convert the tribes of Alba. He would die there 34 years later in front of the church altar after midnight on the 9th of June, 597. Iona would carry on as the head of the Columban Federation in Ireland, Scotland and Northern England for another 200 years, where it became a place of pilgrimage and the burial site of many kings from a number of countries. That was until the 800s, the early 800s, when after repeated attacks and sackings by the dreaded Vikings from the north, it forced a partial withdrawal from Iona to the relative safety of inland Kells and County Meath, where a new monastery was completed in the early 800s. Kells was then to become the Canonath, or head abode of the Columbans for the next 3 centuries. It is, of course, most famous for the Book of Kells, which, although most certainly was fashioned on Iona, was moved for its safety to this new monastery, where it was housed for the next 700 years. But soon the Vikings were ransacking Kells also, as were the various warring local factions, which resulted in the numerous burnings and destructions as noted in the annalistic records for that period. And so in the early 12th century, the head office was in turn moved to Derry instead. A Champel Moor, or great cathedral, was built to replace the small original monastic church where the diminutive St. Augustine's Church here now stands. It was here in Derry that the middle life of Columcille was written around 1150, which, as well as trying to put some chronological shape on Columcille's life story, also records in writing Garton as being the birthplace of the saint for the very first time. But instead of Derry growing to become the centre and head of the Columban Federation for the next couple of centuries, it actually was to witness its demise instead. For a long time, monasteries had ruled the roost in Ireland, controlled as they were by their local clans. This was not a situation that was very palatable to Rome, and so a diocesan system was introduced, each controlled by a bishop, under strict instruction from the Vatican. These new dioceses mirrored the territories once controlled by their local clans, which is why Raphoe in Tyrconnell, or Donegal, is Donegal without Inishowen, while Inishowen Peninsula is in the Diocese of Derry, along with Derry and Tyrone, once controlled by the Kinloan. New orders were taken in from the continent, such as the Cistercians and later the Franciscans, and so the Columban order ceased to be. A new Cistercian abbey, for example, was built on Iona to replace the old Columban monastery and was built literally on top of it. Around the same time, Colmcille's clan, the Kinalluya, who were to become known as the O'Donnells, were to break out of their local area and take over the whole of Donegal. Yet they would always come back to their homeland to inaugurate each new chieftain. And just as their ancestors had done before them, the first part of the ceremony took place at the monastic church of Kilmacrennan. They would then move out in procession with the inauguration stone along the way of the kings to Doon Rock. This ceremony couldn't take place without the head of the O'Friel clan, the closest blood relatives of Colmcille, being present. The 22nd of these O'Donnell chieftains was Manus O'Donnell, the grandfather of Reg Hugh. Like all fellow Irish chieftains, he had to be steely-minded and tough in order to achieve control and then to keep it. Into each fight with his enemies, his forces would carry the Cathach, or battle book, the book of Psalms supposedly copied by Colmcille as a battle standard. It was borne by its hereditary keepers, the McGroarty family, in an ornate cúdach or box. But Manus O'Donnell was also a refined man of letters, as well as being a skilled poet. 1521 had been a notable year, being the 1000th commemoration of the birth of his illustrious ancestor Colmcille. It seems to have sparked Manus into a number of projects to suitably commemorate the saint, where he had 3 buildings erected at sites important in the saint's life story. At Garton, his birthplace, his baptismal site at Temple Douglas, and where he was first educated at Kilmacrennan. Now, we have no definitive proof that it was he who planned and bankrolled these buildings, but they are all early 16th century in date and all of a similar build. And one has to question as to who else would have had either the wealth or the interest to take on such an ambitious building program at that time. The third and largest of these buildings, the new abbey in Kilmacrennan, is undoubtedly where he himself was inaugurated in 1537. 5 years before that, in 1532, he had finished the monumental compilation titled Bacha Colmcille, or the Life of Colmcille, in his newly built castle in Lifford. He had tasked his team of Franciscan monks to go out and collect all the written and oral tales pertaining to Colmcille, which were put together and translated over a period of around 10 years. What resulted was a huge manuscript of detail, folk tales and legends, as well as many short verses of poetry. We get the likes of the story of the copying of the Cathach, or battle book, the story of Garton clay, and the birthstone for the first time. Just 70 years after this manuscript was finished and the abbey had been completed, and all was to change utterly, following defeat in the 9 Years' War and the flight of the Earls. The English were to implement the plantation of Ulster, which resulted in the old clan ways dying out forever. The harsh penal laws were then to follow. These actions were to result in the likes of the O'Donnell inauguration stone and the birthstone of Colmcille disappearing, and their whereabouts are still not known to this day. This birthstone, which Manus tells us once had thousands flocking to it, looking for cures, was over time to be replaced in folklore by Leathnacui, or the flagstone of loneliness. And so, as you can see, history is constantly being lost and made up. As we mark another commemoration, it has been the motivation for us historians to have a look at the whole story again and to try and shed new light on some of the detail that has been lost over time. It has been a year like no other, where many events planned as commemorations have had to be deferred or cancelled during the dreadful pandemic. And yet there is a Columban precedence for this. Adamnan tells us that one day on Iona, one of Colmcille's monks remarked that if and when his master would pass away, the people would sail from all over Scotland and Ireland for the saint's funeral. Colmcille overheard him and corrected him, prophesying that only his familiar monks would perform his funeral rites and sing his requiem. During the saint's wake and funeral, the winds became so strong that it was not possible for any boats to set out to sea and to go to Iona. Immediately after his burial, the seas became perfectly calm again. So let's hope that we too experience this perfect calm for ourselves very soon. I hope that you enjoyed this wee talk where we've just scratched the surface really. If you have any question or comment that you would like to make on it, please feel free to contact me at this email address, stcolumcille@gmail.com. Thanking you so much for tuning in.
And now we will have the children from Rathdonnell School in the parish of Kilmacrennan who will present an animation on St. Columcille.
St. Columcille was born in Garton, County Donegal in 521 AD. His mother was a princess named Ethna, and it is thought that he was a descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages, a former High King of Ireland.
When Colmcille grew up, he realized that he wanted a religious life, so he went to study to become a monk in a monastery in Clonard, County Meath. It was a hard life there. He had to build his own hut to live in, grind his own flour, and even make his own quills to write with.
He was a learned man, and after a while spent living as a monk, he realized that he wanted to become a priest.
As a priest, he was responsible for building many churches around Ireland. The first one he built was in Derry.
St. Columcille wrote a script which caused some problems. St. Finian claimed that the script belonged to him. St. Columcille said that it was his. They were both very angry.
After his argument with St. Finian, St. Columcille left Ireland never to live there again. He travelled to Iona in Scotland by Curragh and set off from Struve Beach in Inishowen. St. Columcille spent a lot of time in Scotland, and he is a very important saint in Scotland as well as Ireland. They even have a legend that he tamed the Loch Ness Monster. St. Columcille died in Scotland in 597. He is buried on the island of Iona. He is the patron saint of County Derry and is one of the 12 apostles of Ireland.
We also welcome the children from the school closest to Colmcille's birthplace, Garton National School, who are here to perform their song that they have composed themselves about St. Columcille.